Coming along today. Our names are Joe Llewellyn and Griffin Leonard, and we're PhD candidates at the National Centre for Peace and Conflict Studies at this university. This is a joint paper, so we're probably going to stand up and sit down a bit as we go through separate sections. We'll see how that goes. And I'd like to just thank Edwina as well. I was very glad when I saw Edwina was presenting before us, because she's kind of brought all the content behind what we're talking about, so hopefully we can build off a lot of the things that she's already mentioned. So we've written this to generate some debate around Aotearoa New Zealand's defence policy and call into question the efficacy of military means by which we currently try to secure Aotearoa New Zealand. And this current approach, as Edwina showed, costs over $10 million a day, a figure that's increasing. So we're going to basically talk you through our paper, and this will involve a brief discussion of the New Zealand Defence Force, the NZDF, its capacities and its stated purpose. And we'll follow this by lifting 5 types of arguments that are commonly used in claiming that New Zealand requires the NZDF. And we're going to suggest that they provide there's shaky foundations to which we should maintain the NZDF as we talk about non-violent alternatives that we think would be better suited to defending New Zealand and creating security. And I think it's important to note that when we're talking about security, we're using Ken Booth's notion of human security, which he defines as survival plus, which refers to people being free from, and I quote, life-determining threats and therefore having space to make choices in their lives. So this conception of security suggests more than defence against attack. It's also about the access to the means of life, to healthcare, to a healthy environment, to help when needed, such as in the case of natural disasters. And we adopt this definition as opposed to more traditional notions of national security, as we don't see any value in national security that doesn't provide this basic standard of living for all citizens. And we also believe it's possible for Aotearoa New Zealand to achieve the security that we're talking about. So, pacifists have made arguments against military for a long time, and broadly we see 2 different lines of pacifist argument. The first is a principled position based on a moral opposition to war. The second is pragmatic, stating that war leads to negative and unpredictable outcomes in practice and therefore shouldn't be something we do. Both agree that due to war being a method of defending opposition through injury, so war's purely destructive and should therefore be rejected. It can't build security because it enhances insecurity as it kills, it maims, it displaces, it destroys infrastructure. So our line of argument here is going to be mostly pragmatic as we go through. So I'll hand over to Griff. We might just spoil it.
Cheers. So the military means of security do have a poor track record. Recent wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, of which the former of which the NZDF was involved, sort of haven't achieved their stated aims or their short-term aims of preventing terrorist violence in the region, but they have led to a number of other unintended, unproductive, destabilising consequences. And most people who defend war do accept that it is a regrettable last resort, but we would argue that here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, we haven't given enough consideration to the alternatives to really actually make this claim. And as Nicholas Parkin wrote in a recent article in the Journal of Military Ethics, quote, given the importance of the last resort criterion to just war reasoning, it is somewhat surprising that just war theorists have not spent more time discussing alternatives to war, end quote. And in making an argument that Aotearoa New Zealand doesn't need an NZDF, it is important to be really clear and explicit about what the NZDF is and what they do. So the NZDF, as Edwina clearly showed, is primarily a force for armed combat. Nothing really makes this clearer than their own statements. TJ Keating is chief of the NZDF, and a recent quote of his is, quote, our purpose is to provide the government of the day with credible and effective options to deliver an armed response for New Zealand's interests are at stake. So first and foremost, we are a force prepared for combat, end quote. Also, as demonstrated by Edwina, the sort of financial aspect demonstrates this as well. Of the nearly sort of, or more than $3.5 billion allocated by the government to NZDF, $2 billion goes towards force preparedness for, quote, joint operations to provide the government with a range of military forces to protect and advance the security and interests of New Zealand. And in addition, another $700 million is, I think in this financial year, being used to acquire assets for the Defence Force, and some of their sort of public information, such as their websites, is almost quite braggy, I guess, about how a lot of this is going to be for situations of military combat. So on the Army website is a quote sort of saying, quote, "As you would expect, much of the technology at our disposal is designed to help us excel in combat situations," which sort of suggests that a lot of the technology acquired is in fact for operations. I think it's also really important to point out that we don't actually compare well to others. I think that is a perception, but in fact we're actually really poor in terms of the economics of it. In 2014, per active troop, New Zealand spent around $300,000 whereas the global average was about 66,000.
So we list 5 primary reasons why it's often assumed that Aotearoa New Zealand needs to retain a military, as Edwin has already alluded to a lot of these. So these are offensive capabilities to attack foreign governments, defensive capabilities to protect New Zealand, humanitarian relief efforts, peacekeeping operations, and protection of New Zealand's economic interests. So we're going to work through those each briefly now. So in regard to the first, we think there is an argument for removing dictators. However, we would say that war has not been successful in achieving this, as recent examples like Afghanistan and Iraq demonstrate. And compared to foreign-backed wars, internal resistance to oppressive regimes is a lot more successful. Going further again, and this is linking into a lot of research that people have been quoting throughout this conference, non-violent resistance seems to be a lot more effective than any other means of disposing dictators. So Chenoweth and Stephan find that from 1900 to 2006, non-violence has been twice as effective as violent resistance in removing dictators. And on top of this, countries that experience non-violent movements have higher levels of democracy after a change that lasts a lot longer. They're a lot less likely to experience violence in society after the change. And then on top of that, Chenoweth and Schock find that when you have movements that combine violence and non-violence, they sit in between. So we have a success where non-violence is most successful, combined movements are in between, and then violence, resistance least, and then almost no success from foreign governments coming in and invading. Basically, non-violence works through removing pillars of support, so each government is held up by pillars of people doing various things for it. This could be the military, the police, media, workers, anyone who does what a government needs, and anyone who wants to remove a government needs to remove these pillars in various ways. So we're saying non-violence is the effective way to do this, and maybe if we want to assist in helping people live in more democratic countries, then maybe we're better putting money into researching how to do this most effectively and supporting non-violent resistance movements than we are investing in our military, which is totally ineffective. So this brings me on to the next point, which is about national defence. I think it's important to note that while we're spending a lot on our military per capita, our military is actually very small, and if there was a nation that had the resources to get all the way to New Zealand and occupy it and maintain that occupation, I don't think, even if we were arguing on military lines, our military has any capacity to actually prevent that. Furthermore, which is probably the most important point, there's no direct military threats to New Zealand, which the Defence Force multiple times has noted as being an issue, as in some cases they've said that it's their main threat, is that they don't have a threat. And they write in their defence assessment that it's extremely unlikely that there'll be any need to defend New Zealand within the next 40 years at least, and it would take a really significant change to global politics for that to be any different. But still, we talk about the need for this defence force. Similar to, hypothetically, if a country did want to invade New Zealand, we still think there are non-violent alternatives that would be much better than having a military. So if we return to the idea of pillars of support that I was talking about before, any invading government also needs these pillars to be able to take what it wants out of the country and have control over it. It needs people to do various things for it. And civilian-based defence, which is a term that I think was coined by Gene Sharp, or at least Gene Sharp did a lot of work on it in the 70s and 80s, refers to the training of a population to undermine and resist invaders using non-violent techniques. It removes their sources of power, so their authority, their material resources, their human resources, their skills and knowledge, and intangible factors such as the psychological and ideological factors that hold up an invader. And it also highlights the need to maintain a pre-planned system of self-government during occupation, so it would likely include the decentralisation of a country's infrastructure, resources and decision-making platforms, which we also think, going back to our discussions of definition of security we were using before, if we embrace this, would actually help create New Zealand, more human security in New Zealand for people, as it empowers communities. As Gene Sharp also notes, the deterrence capacity of civilian-based defence is based upon an actual defence capacity, so given that New Zealand has a very small military, and if there was a massive military that did come here to try and invade, we think that if they could either be faced with our small amount of military personnel, or they could be faced with an entire population that's going to make it extremely difficult for them to do anything they want to do, that civilian-based defence is potentially a bigger deterrent than our military. And there are examples of where civilian-based defence has been used. So it was used in Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia to protect against Soviet attacks in 1991. It was also used successfully in Czechoslovakia in the 1960s, among some other examples. So I'll hand back over to Griff.
People, we have about 5 minutes.
You can use my script.
So yeah, as Joe pointed out, we don't currently face direct military threats. However, there are threats that we do face, and the military has acknowledged that due to New Zealand's position between tectonic plates, its geographical isolation, and ongoing climate change, we're likely to confront more natural disasters in the coming years. And there are fundamental problems with the country using its military forces as a primary disaster responder, as we do here. We would argue that currently the NZDF is used mostly as a convenient source of organised labour rather than as an organisation that actually has the specific skills and technology required to meet the varying needs of civilians during times of disasters. It's actually noted in the National Civilian Defence Emergency Management Plan Order that, quote, the New Zealand Defence Force cannot guarantee that certain resources will always be available for disaster relief because they may be involved in another government-directed mission. After the Christchurch earthquake, Aotearoa New Zealand accepted expert response teams from Taiwan and Japan, and we don't see any reason why we couldn't develop a similar capacity here for national and international deployment. An example of a non-military and voluntarily run organisation equipped and trained specifically for life-saving purposes is the Royal National Lifeboat Institution in the UK. And such organisations respond in emergency situations with the skills and equipment specifically for rescue rather than with the technology and skills primarily for combat. Moving on to sort of the idea of the NZDF's role in protecting fisheries or maritime security more broadly, just very briefly, I think similar arguments apply as with disaster response. Various components of this job, maritime protection, such as search and rescue, pollution reduction, preventing illegal fishing and stopping illegal immigration, do not require a military capacity at all. The existence of groups like Greenpeace and Sea Shepherd show that our current fisheries protection are insufficient. Search and rescue can be performed by a competent Coast Guard, and military responses to boat people have been shown to be both, well, all of immoral, illegal, and inefficient and ineffective in Australia. Regarding peacekeeping, following the NZDF's deployment to East Timor, a transition began whereby the proportion of NZDF personnel on deployment to UN operations decreased relative to their deployment in non-UN operations such as those in Afghanistan and Iraq. I think a step that's sort of indicative of this is that in 2011, the New Zealand government contributed 22 million to the UN peacekeeping operation budget, which amounts to all of sort of 2 days of their military funding. This transition occurred at the same time that peacekeeping in the traditional sense became more militarised while still being pitched as humanitarian. And these operations, as Nikki Hager and John Stevenson have helped illuminate, are a far cry from sort of more traditional peacekeeping operations that were originally often mandated to monitor pre-established ceasefires. The historical record of UN peacekeeping and peace building is also checkered at best. The UN has recognised its own shortcomings, and many scholars have criticised peacekeeping and peace building operations on a number of fronts. Some operations have stopped immediate violence, but they have been less successful in repairing or healing societies and thus preventing ongoing or further violence or social problems such as inequality. This is not to say that these failures stem from the work of New Zealand's peacekeepers. It's just a point to say that if these operations have such sort of checkered outcomes, then they can't really be the sole argument for maintaining a defence force, we would argue.
I'd really ask you to begin to wind up.
Okay. Cool, thank you, that's right. We are very close anyway. And we would also point you in the direction of literature that has shown that there are effective non-violent alternatives to protecting civilians in war zones. And I'll pass on to Joe to wrap it up.
Thank you.
So as a final point, which Edwin has also touched on this, the amount of money we're spending on the New Zealand Defence Force is kind of counterbalanced by chronic underfunding of the actual institutions that lead to human security as we defined it before. So we have an underfunded healthcare system, we have reduced or cut funding for services for survivors of sexual abuse, we have little action on domestic violence, of which New Zealand has some of the worst outcomes for in the OECD. We have increasing inequality, increasing poverty, and insufficient action on climate change. And this $10 million a day, which is increasing, could go be much more efficiently used if we actually wanted to create a secure New Zealand for people. So thank you for listening to us.